Case 1. Tiffany Moss, the Starvation Chamber. Our first case takes us to Lawrenceville, Georgia, in the fall of 2013. On November 2nd of that year, first responders arrived at an apartment complex following reports of a dead child. What they discovered would become one of the most horrific child abuse cases in Georgia history. 10-year-old Emani Moss weighed just 32 pounds when she died. To put that in perspective, a healthy 10-year-old girl should weigh between 60 and 90 pounds. Emani weighed less than most toddlers. Her stepmother, Tiffany Moss, had systematically starved this little girl to death while feeding her own biological children. But the starvation was just the beginning of the horror. Investigators discovered that Emani had been locked in a bedroom, denied food, beaten with belts and baseball bats, and forced to live in conditions so deplorable that the stench was overwhelming. Her tiny body showed signs of prolonged abuse, broken bones that had healed incorrectly, burns, and evidence of repeated trauma. When Emani finally succumbed to the torture, Tiffany Moss and Emani's biological father, Emani Moss, didn't call for help. They didn't rush her to the hospital. Instead, they placed her emaciated body in a trash can, poured charcoal lighter fluid over her, and set her on fire in the apartment complex. A neighbor smelled the burning and called 911. When firefighters arrived and extinguished the flames, they discovered what remained of little Emani. The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic abuse that had lasted for months, possibly years. School records showed that Emani had been withdrawn from school, isolating her from anyone who might notice her deteriorating condition. Text messages between Tiffany and Emani Moss showed a callous disregard for Emani's suffering, with references to the child as a burden and discussions about how to dispose of her body. In April of 2019, Tiffany Moss went to trial. In a shocking decision, she chose to represent herself, cross-examining witnesses and making her own arguments. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: medical examiner testimony about Emani's starvation, forensic evidence of the burning, and those damning text messages. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tiffany Moss of murder, child cruelty, and concealing a death. The sentencing phase was equally swift. On April 30th, 2019, Tiffany Moss became the first woman sentenced to death in Georgia in over 70 years. Today, Tiffany Moss sits on death row at Arendelle State Prison in Alto, Georgia. She will never see freedom again. She will never enjoy a holiday meal while Emani never even got basic sustenance. She will never celebrate another birthday outside prison walls while Emani never made it to her 11th. Emani Moss's biological father, Emani Moss, pleaded guilty and received life without parole plus 30 years. But it was Tiffany Moss, the stepmother who should have protected this child, who received the ultimate punishment. Case 2. Lamora Williams, the Oven Horror. If you thought the first case was disturbing, steel yourself. Our second case involves a crime so unthinkable that even veteran homicide detectives were left traumatized. October 13th, 2017. Atlanta, Georgia. A man received a video call from his girlfriend, Lamora Williams, showing him something that would haunt him forever: the bodies of his 2 young sons in a kitchen oven. 1-year-old Jacarter Penn and 2-year-old Kuyant Penn were found dead in their mother's apartment. When police arrived, they discovered both children had been placed inside the oven. The medical examiner would later determine they had been burned while alive. Lamora Williams was 24 years old and the mother of 4 children. On that October night, she was alone with her 4 sons in an apartment on the west side of Atlanta. According to the investigation, Williams had been struggling with mental health issues and financial stress, but what she did next had nothing to do with a momentary breakdown. The evidence suggested premeditation. Williams had researched methods online. She had made specific preparations. And when she committed this unspeakable act, she documented it, sending that video to the children's father, perhaps as some twisted form of revenge or cry for attention. The 2 older children in the apartment, ages 3 and 4 at the time, were unharmed physically but witnessed horrors no child should ever see. They were immediately placed in protective custody. The investigation into Lamora Williams revealed a troubled history. She had previous involvement with the Division of Family and Children's Services. There had been reports of neglect, but the children had remained in her care. Neighbors reported hearing arguments and children crying, But no one suspected the unthinkable nightmare unfolding behind closed doors. Forensic evidence painted a clear picture. The temperature settings on the oven, the positioning of the children's bodies, the timeline established through phone records and witnesses, all of it pointed to deliberate, calculated murder. Williams was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder for counts of child cruelty and other related charges. She was held without bond at the Fulton County Jail while awaiting trial. The trial took years to reach its conclusion. Williams's defense team attempted to argue mental illness, claiming she suffered from postpartum depression and psychosis. But prosecutors presented evidence that Williams knew right from wrong, had made deliberate choices, and had shown consciousness of guilt through her actions after the murders. Testimony from the medical examiner was particularly damning. The children had suffered immensely. The defense's mental health argument couldn't overcome the premeditated nature of the crimes and the extreme suffering inflicted. In November of 2024, after years of legal proceedings, Lamora Williams was finally sentenced. The judge handed down life without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 35 years. The sentence ensures that Williams will spend every remaining day of her life behind bars. The father of Carter and Keontae Penn gave a victim impact statement that brought the courtroom to tears. He described his boys' laughter, their dreams, their potential, all extinguished by the one person who should have protected them above all others. Lamora Williams is currently incarcerated in a Georgia women's prison. She will never hold her children again. She will never celebrate another Mother's Day outside prison walls. She will never know freedom. And that is exactly what justice demands. Case 3. Sophia Williams, the potty training nightmare. Potty training is a normal, if sometimes frustrating, part of child development. Most parents handle accidents with patience and understanding. But for 4-year-old Anthony Weiss, a potty training accident became his death sentence. In 2022, DeKalb County Police were called to an apartment where they found Anthony Weiss unresponsive. The little boy's body showed signs of severe trauma. He had been beaten so badly that he died from his injuries. His mother, Sophia Williams, told police that Anthony had fallen. But the medical examiner's report told a very different story. Anthony's autopsy revealed multiple blunt force trauma injuries consistent with being beaten, not from a fall. He had fractured ribs, internal bleeding, severe bruising across his torso, and head trauma. The pattern of injuries indicated repeated strikes with significant force. As investigators dug deeper, a horrifying picture emerged. Sophia Williams had been abusing Anthony for some time, but the final beating occurred after the 4-year-old had a potty training accident. According to evidence presented at trial, Williams flew into a rage, beating the child with her fists and possibly other objects. Anthony's siblings, who were in the home, witnessed parts of the abuse but were too terrified to intervene or tell anyone what was happening. The investigation revealed that Williams had a history of using excessive physical punishment, but the violence had escalated over time. Sophia Williams was a single mother struggling to raise multiple children. According to family members, she often seemed overwhelmed and stressed. But stress and frustration never justify what she did to her son. Witnesses testified that Williams had become increasingly volatile in the months before Anthony's death. She had isolated herself and her children from extended family members who might have noticed the abuse. School records showed that Anthony had missed several days in the weeks before his death, a common red flag in child abuse cases. The day Anthony died, Williams waited hours before calling for help. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The 4-year-old was pronounced dead at the scene. Sophia Williams was arrested and charged with murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and cruelty to children. She was held without bond at the DeKalb County Jail. Her trial took place in late 2024. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The medical examiner's testimony, statements from Anthony's siblings, forensic evidence from the apartment, and Williams's own changing statements to police. The defense attempted to argue that Williams had been suffering from extreme stress and mental health issues, but the jury wasn't swayed. The deliberate nature of the beating, the delay in seeking help, and the attempts to cover up the crime all pointed to a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. On December 5, 2024, Sophia Williams was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years. In his sentencing remarks, the judge stated that Williams had betrayed the most fundamental duty of parenthood and that Anthony's death was entirely preventable. He noted that the severity of the sentence reflected not just the killing itself, but the pattern of abuse that preceded it. Sophia Williams is now serving her sentence in a Georgia state prison. She will never tuck another child into bed. She will never celebrate another child's birthday. She will grow old and die behind bars, never knowing freedom again. Anthony Weiss was only 4 years old. He should be in elementary school now, making friends, learning to read, experiencing all the joys of childhood. Instead, his life was cut short by the one person who should have loved him unconditionally. Case 4. Jennifer Rosenbaum, the failed foster mother. Foster parents are supposed to provide safety and care for children who have already experienced trauma and loss. They undergo background checks, training, and home studies. The system is designed to protect vulnerable children. But in 2015, that system failed 2-year-old Layla Daniel in the most tragic way possible. Jennifer Rosenbaum and her husband Joseph were licensed foster parents in Putnam County, Georgia. They had fostered multiple children over the years. From the outside, they appeared to be a loving family providing a service to children in need. But behind closed doors, they were running a house of horrors. On November 17, 2015, emergency services received a call from the Rosenbaum home. 2-year-old Layla Daniel was unresponsive. When paramedics arrived, they found a severely malnourished toddler who weighed only 19 pounds, less than most 1-year-olds. Layla was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner's report revealed the true horror of her short life. Layla had died from severe malnutrition and dehydration. Her body showed signs of prolonged neglect and abuse. She had pressure sores from being confined. Her organs had begun to fail from lack of nutrition. And most damning of all, while Layla was starving to death, the Rosenbaum's biological children and other foster children in the home were well-fed and healthy. The investigation revealed that Jennifer Rosenbaum had specifically targeted Layla for abuse and neglect. The little girl had been confined to a closet or small room, denied adequate food and water, and left in filthy conditions. Other children in the home testified that Layla was treated differently, that she was punished more severely, fed separately with smaller portions, and isolated from the rest of the family. They described hearing her cry from hunger and seeing her tiny, frail body. Records showed that caseworkers had visited the Rosenbaum home, but Jennifer Rosenbaum had become adept at hiding the abuse. She would clean Layla up before visits, feed her temporarily to improve her appearance, and keep her hidden during inspections. Text messages and diary entries revealed Jennifer Rosenbaum's twisted mindset. She viewed Layla as difficult and burdensome. She resented the child and seemed to take pleasure in denying her basic necessities. Layla's case exposed serious failures in Georgia's foster care oversight system. How had a licensed foster parent been able to starve a child to death while under state supervision? Why hadn't caseworkers noticed Layla's deteriorating condition? These questions led to reforms in how Georgia monitors foster homes. But for Layla, those changes came too late. The Division of Family and Children's Services conducted an internal review and found multiple missed opportunities to remove Layla from the home. Warning signs had been overlooked or ignored. The system designed to protect her had failed catastrophically. Jennifer Rosenbaum was arrested and charged with murder, felony murder, and multiple counts of child cruelty. Her husband Joseph was also charged, though with lesser offenses for failing to protect Layla. Jennifer's trial began in 2016. The prosecution presented medical evidence, testimony from other children in the home, and damning documentary evidence of the systematic neglect. The defense attempted to shift blame to Joseph or claim that Layla had pre-existing medical conditions, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted Jennifer Rosenbaum on all counts. At sentencing, the judge handed down life in prison plus 40 years, ensuring that even with Georgia's previous parole laws, Jennifer Rosenbaum would never see freedom. At her current age, she would be well over 100 years old before even being considered for release. Jennifer Rosenbaum is currently incarcerated at Pulaski State Prison. She will never foster another child. She will never abuse another vulnerable toddler. She will spend the rest of her natural life behind bars. Layla Daniel was buried in a small ceremony attended by advocates for foster children. Her biological family, who had been working toward reunification when she died, mourned the little girl they never got to bring home. Her death led to Layla's law in Georgia, which increased oversight of foster homes and mandatory reporting requirements. But no law can bring back the 2-year-old who starved to death while in the care of a woman who was supposed to protect her. Case 5. Lynn Turner, the Black Widow of Georgia. Not all mothers who kill target their children. Some target the fathers. And in the case of Lynn Turner, she didn't kill once. She killed twice, using the same method both times. Lynn Turner seemed to have terrible luck with men. Her husband died suddenly in 1995. Her boyfriend died suddenly in 2001. Both deaths were initially ruled as natural causes. But when investigators took a closer look, they discovered that Lynn Turner wasn't unlucky. She was a cold-blooded killer. Glenn Turner was a Cobb County police officer. He and Lynn had been married for several years and had 2 young children together. On March 3, 1995, Glenn came home from work feeling ill. His symptoms worsened throughout the evening: nausea, vomiting, difficulty breathing. Lynn called 911, but by the time paramedics arrived, Glenn was in cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. He was only 31 years old. The medical examiner initially ruled the death as heart disease, despite Glenn being a fit, healthy police officer with no history of heart problems. The death was ruled natural, and Lynn collected Glenn's life insurance policy, over $150,000. She played the grieving widow perfectly, raising her 2 children as a single mother and eventually moving on with her life. 6 years later, Lynn had a new boyfriend, Randy Thompson, a firefighter. He was healthy, athletic, and had his whole life ahead of him. But in January of 2001, Randy suddenly became ill with the same symptoms Glenn had experienced: nausea, vomiting, difficulty breathing. Randy Thompson died on January 22, 2001. He was only 32 years old. Once again, the death was initially ruled as natural causes. Once again, Lynn Turner was the beneficiary of a substantial life insurance policy. But this time, Randy's family wasn't satisfied with the explanation. 2 healthy, athletic men in their early 30s don't just drop dead from heart problems. They pushed for a more thorough investigation. When investigators began digging into Randy Thompson's death, they decided to also re-examine Glenn Turner's death. Both men's bodies were exhumed, and new autopsies were performed with more sophisticated toxicology testing. The results were shocking. Both men had died from ethylene glycol poisoning, antifreeze poisoning. Antifreeze contains ethylene glycol, which is sweet-tasting and can be easily mixed into drinks. When ingested, it causes symptoms similar to intoxication at first, followed by nausea, vomiting, and eventually kidney failure, cardiac arrest, and death. The timeline and evidence suggested that Lynn Turner had poisoned both men over a period of days, giving them small amounts of antifreeze mixed into their drinks or food. The symptoms would have been agonizing, but both men trusted Lynn to care for them while they were sick, never knowing she was the one making them sick. The motive became clear: money. Lynn Turner had collected hundreds of thousands of dollars in life insurance from both deaths. She had expensive tastes and was living beyond her means. The insurance money allowed her to maintain her lifestyle. But there was also evidence of other motives. She had been having affairs during both relationships. Killing her partners was easier than divorcing them or breaking up with them. Text messages and witness testimony revealed that Lynn Turner was manipulative and narcissistic. She showed no real emotion about the deaths beyond crocodile tears performed for others. Behind the mask of the grieving widow was a cold, calculating killer. Lynn Turner was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. She was tried separately for each death. In 2007, she was convicted of murdering Glenn Turner and sentenced to life in prison. In 2008, she was convicted of murdering Randy Thompson and sentenced to another life sentence without the possibility of parole. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The toxicology reports, evidence that she had purchased antifreeze before both deaths, her access to both victims when they were symptomatic, and her financial motive. Lynn Turner never showed remorse for her crimes. She maintained her innocence despite the mountain of evidence against her. She appealed her convictions repeatedly, all unsuccessful. On August 31, 2010, Lynn Turner was found dead in her cell at Metro State Prison in Atlanta. She had overdosed on medications, the same way she had killed 2 men. Some speculated it was suicide, others wondered if she had been stockpiling medication for an escape attempt gone wrong. Either way, Lynn Turner never saw freedom again. She died in prison at age 42, having served just 3 years of her life sentence. Glenn Turner's children grew up without their father. Randy Thompson's family never got the full justice they deserved with her early death. But make no mistake, Lynn Turner was a calculated killer who murdered 2 men in cold blood for money and convenience. She may have died before spending decades in prison, but she died where she belonged, behind bars, never to harm anyone else again. Case 6. Candice Crocker, the backyard burial. In November of 2018, investigators in Griffin, Georgia, made a discovery that would shock the community to its core. In the backyard of a modest home, they found the buried bodies of 2 teenagers, 14-year-old Mary Crocker and 12-year-old Elwyn Crocker Jr. The children's stepmother, Candice Crocker, had starved and tortured them to death, while her own biological children lived comfortably in the same house. The investigation began when someone reported that they hadn't seen the Crocker children in years. When police arrived at the home on November 20, 2018, Candice Crocker and her husband Elwyn Crocker Sr. claimed the children were with relatives. But investigators were suspicious. They obtained a search warrant and began examining the property. What they found in the backyard was every parent's worst nightmare. Buried in shallow graves were the skeletal remains of Mary and Elwyn Jr. Forensic analysis revealed they had been dead for months, possibly years. Their bodies showed signs of severe malnutrition, physical abuse, and neglect. As the investigation unfolded, the true horror of the Crocker children's final years came to light. According to evidence and testimony from other people in the home, Mary and Elwyn Jr. had been systematically starved, beaten, and confined. While Candice's biological children attended school, had friends, and lived normal lives, Mary and Elwyn Jr. were hidden away. They were locked in rooms, denied food, and subjected to brutal punishments for minor infractions. The children had been withdrawn from school years earlier, supposedly for homeschooling. But no education was provided. Instead, they were isolated, ensuring no one would notice their deteriorating condition. Neighbors later reported that they hadn't seen the children in years but assumed they had moved away or were staying with other family members. The Crockers had become skilled at deflecting questions and hiding the abuse. Evidence presented at trial painted a picture of systematic torture. The children were given barely enough food to survive, and eventually not even that. They were beaten for minor infractions. They were denied medical care even when seriously ill or injured. Text messages between Candice Crocker and her husband showed a disturbing lack of empathy. They discussed the children as burdens and problems, never as human beings deserving of love and care. The biological mother of Mary and Elwyn Jr. had lost custody years earlier due to her own issues. The children had been placed with their father and stepmother, supposedly for a better life. Instead, they found themselves in hell. When Mary and Elwyn Jr. died, likely from starvation and untreated medical conditions, Candice and Elwyn Sr. buried them in the backyard like they were disposing of trash. They then carried on with their lives, celebrating holidays, going on trips, and raising their other children as if nothing had happened. Candice Crocker was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of cruelty to children, and concealing a death. Her husband, Elwyn Crocker Sr., faced similar charges. The trial was emotionally devastating. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, testimony from neighbors and family members who had been kept in the dark, and those damning text messages. The defense had no real argument. The evidence was overwhelming. The children's skeletal remains told the story of prolonged starvation. The condition of the graves showed callous disregard for human dignity. In February of 2020, Candice Crocker was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole, 1 life sentence for each child she murdered. In his sentencing remarks, the judge said that Candice Crocker had committed acts of evil, and that the children's suffering was incomprehensible. He noted that while she fed and cared for her own biological children, she systematically murdered her stepchildren through starvation and abuse. Candice Crocker is currently serving her sentence at Pulaski State Prison in Georgia. She will never leave those walls alive. She will never enjoy another family meal while Mary and Elwyn Jr. lie in graves. She will never celebrate another holiday while those children remain forever 14 and 12 years old. Elwyn Crocker Sr. also received a life sentence for his role in the murders. Both parents will die in prison, which is exactly what they deserve. Mary and Elwyn Crocker Jr. were buried properly in a ceremony attended by advocates for abused children and members of the community who mourned 2 young lives lost to unthinkable cruelty. Case 7. Kimberly Wright, the grandmother's betrayal. If you were paying attention to the previous case, you might be wondering, was anyone else in that house? Did anyone else know what was happening to Mary and Elwyn Crocker Jr.? The answer is yes. And that person was their step-grandmother, Kimberly Wright. Wright lived in the same home where those children were being starved and tortured. She watched it happen. She participated in it. And when those children died, she helped bury the evidence. Kimberly Wright was Candice Crocker's mother. She lived with the family and was present during the years of abuse that led to the children's deaths. According to the investigation, Wright wasn't just a passive bystander. She was an active participant in the abuse. Evidence showed that Wright had helped confine the children, had denied them food, and had participated in punishments. She had access to phones and could have called for help at any time. She could have reported the abuse to authorities. She could have fed the children when Candice wasn't looking. She did none of those things. When Mary and Elwyn Jr. died, Kimberly Wright helped with the cover-up. She knew the children were buried in the backyard. She knew the family was lying to relatives and authorities about the children's whereabouts. She helped maintain the fiction that the children were alive and well. For years, Wright lived in that house, walked past that backyard, and said nothing. She celebrated holidays and family gatherings while 2 children she could have saved lay buried just outside. While Candice Crocker and Elwyn Crocker Sr. were arrested and convicted in 2018 and 2019, Kimberly Wright's case took longer to prosecute. The legal system was determining her exact level of culpability and what charges were appropriate. Wright was initially charged as an accomplice, but as more evidence emerged about her active role in the abuse, those charges were upgraded. Prosecutors argued that she wasn't merely aware of the abuse, she participated in it, and was therefore equally guilty. Kimberly Wright's trial finally took place in early 2025, more than 6 years after the children's bodies were discovered. The prosecution presented evidence of her active participation in the abuse, testimony from other family members, text messages showing her knowledge and involvement, and forensic evidence placing her at the scene during key moments. The defense attempted to portray Wright as a victim herself, dominated by her daughter Candice and afraid to speak up. But the evidence told a different story. Wright had opportunities to save those children and chose not to. She had autonomy and freedom of movement. She simply chose cruelty over compassion. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of cruelty to children, and concealing deaths. On January 15, 2025, Kimberly Wright was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The judge stated that Wright's role as a grandmother and older adult made her crimes even more reprehensible. Those children should have been able to turn to her for help, for protection, for love. Instead, she joined in their torture. Kimberly Wright is now incarcerated at Arendelle State Prison in Georgia. At 68 years old, she will spend whatever years she has left behind bars. She will never know freedom again. The Crocker case stands as one of the most disturbing examples of familial abuse in Georgia history, not just because of what happened to those children, but because multiple adults participated in or enabled their deaths. 3 people, Candice Crocker, Elwyn Crocker Sr., and Kimberly Wright, all received life sentences without parole. All 3 will die in prison. And that is exactly the justice that Mary and Elwyn Crocker Jr. deserve. Those children suffered for years while adults who should have protected them instead became their tormentors. Now those adults will suffer the consequences of their evil for the rest of their lives. Case 8. Tanya Monroe, the methamphetamine tragedy. Our 8th case takes us to Savannah, Georgia, where a grandmother's drug addiction led to an infant's death in one of the most preventable tragedies on this list. Tanya Monroe was 51 years old and caring for her grandson, 7-month-old Kobe Shaw, when the unthinkable happened. On February 11, 2022, little Kobe died from methamphetamine poisoning. The baby had ingested meth while in his grandmother's care. On that February morning, emergency services received a call about an unresponsive infant. When paramedics arrived at Tanya Monroe's Savannah home, they found 7-month-old Kobe Shaw in cardiac arrest. Despite resuscitation efforts, the baby was pronounced dead. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed the horrifying truth. Kobe had toxic levels of methamphetamine in his system. The amount was so high that it had caused his heart to stop. How does a 7-month-old baby ingest methamphetamine? The investigation would reveal the disturbing answer. Police obtained a search warrant for Monroe's home. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. The house was littered with drug paraphernalia, pipes, baggies, residue. Methamphetamine was found in multiple locations throughout the home, some within easy reach of a crawling baby. Monroe was a habitual methamphetamine user. She used the drug regularly, often while caring for her grandson. She was high the day Kobe died. The investigation determined that Kobe had likely ingested the methamphetamine in one of several possible ways. He could have picked up residue from surfaces and put his hands in his mouth. He could have found and ingested drug paraphernalia, or Monroe could have even blown smoke toward the baby while using. Regardless of the exact method, the result was the same. A 7-month-old baby died an agonizing death from a drug his grandmother chose to use around him. Tanya Monroe had a long history of drug abuse and criminal involvement. She had previous arrests for drug-related offenses, but had never served significant time. Child Protective Services had been involved with the family before, but Kobe had been allowed to remain in Monroe's care. Friends and family members later testified that they had concerns about Monroe's drug use and her ability to care for an infant, but no one had taken definitive action to remove Kobe from the home. The baby's parents had entrusted Monroe with his care, believing that despite her past issues, she would prioritize her grandson's safety. That trust was catastrophically misplaced. The medical examiner's report was heartbreaking. Kobe's tiny body showed toxic levels of methamphetamine, levels that would have been dangerous for an adult, let alone a 7-month-old infant. The baby would have experienced rapid heart rate, seizures, hyperthermia, and ultimately cardiac arrest. His final hours would have been filled with suffering that he was too young to even understand. The report also noted that Kobe showed signs of general neglect. He was underweight for his age and showed evidence of inadequate care even before the fatal poisoning. Tanya Monroe was arrested and charged with felony murder, second-degree murder, second-degree cruelty to children, possession of methamphetamine, and reckless conduct. She was held without bond at the Chatham County Detention Center. Her trial took place in late 2022. The prosecution presented the toxicology evidence, testimony from the medical examiner, crime scene photos showing the drug-filled environment, and testimony from investigators about Monroe's admitted drug use. The defense attempted to argue that Monroe didn't intentionally harm Kobe, that the exposure was accidental, and that she loved her grandson. But the prosecution countered that choosing to use methamphetamine while caring for an infant was itself a knowing and reckless act that led directly to the child's death. The jury convicted Tanya Monroe on all counts. At sentencing, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke. He stated that Monroe had been given a precious gift, the trust to care for her infant grandson, and she had betrayed that trust in the most catastrophic way possible. He noted that her drug addiction didn't excuse her actions. It explained them, but didn't justify them. On November 18, 2022, Tanya Monroe was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years. Kobe's parents gave victim impact statements that brought the courtroom to tears. They described their baby boy's smile, his developing personality, the milestones he would never reach. They spoke of the trust they had placed in Monroe and how that trust had been shattered. Kobe's mother said, "I will never forgive myself for leaving him with her. But she is the one who killed him. She chose drugs over my baby's life." Tanya Monroe is currently serving her sentence at Pulaski State Prison in Georgia. At 53 years old, she will spend the rest of her life behind bars. She will never hold another grandchild. She will never celebrate another family holiday. She will grow old and die in prison, which is exactly what she deserves. Kobe Shaw was buried in a small ceremony. He was 7 months old enough to recognize his family's faces, to smile and laugh, to begin exploring the world around him. All of that potential was extinguished because his grandmother valued her drug high more than his life. This case serves as a tragic reminder of how drug addiction doesn't just destroy the user's life. It destroys everyone around them, especially the most vulnerable and innocent. Case 9. Leilani Simon, the landfill horror. In October of 2022, Savannah, Georgia became the focus of national attention when a toddler disappeared under suspicious circumstances. 20-month-old Quentin Simon was reported missing by his mother, Leilani Simon, who claimed he had vanished from his crib during the night. But investigators quickly determined this was no ordinary missing child case. This was a murder, and the killer was the one person who should have protected Quentin above all others. On October 5, 2022, Leilani Simon called police to report that her son Quentin was missing. She claimed she had put him to bed the night before, and when she checked on him in the morning, he was gone. Police immediately launched a search, treating it as a critical missing child case. Volunteers combed the neighborhood. Dive teams searched nearby waterways. Canine units tracked scents. But there was no sign of 20-month-old Quentin. As investigators interviewed Leilani Simon, her story began to fall apart. There were inconsistencies in her timeline. Her behavior seemed off. She wasn't acting like a mother whose child had just disappeared. And physical evidence from the home contradicted her account. Within days, investigators shifted their focus from a search and rescue operation to a criminal investigation. They named Leilani Simon as the prime suspect in her son's disappearance and presumed death. Evidence suggested that Quentin had died in the early morning hours of October 5th, and that Leilani had disposed of his body. But where? Cell phone data, surveillance footage, and witness statements led investigators to a horrifying conclusion. Leilani Simon had placed her son's body in a dumpster, and that dumpster had been emptied into a local landfill. What followed was one of the most extensive and heartbreaking searches in Georgia history. For weeks, investigators used heavy machinery and hand sorting to search through tons of garbage at a Chatham County landfill, looking for any trace of Quentin Simon. The conditions were horrific. The smell, the heat, the emotional toll of searching through trash for a baby's remains. But investigators were determined to bring Quentin home and give his family closure. On November 18, 2022, more than a month after Quentin's disappearance, searchers finally found him. Human remains confirmed through DNA testing to be Quentin Simon were recovered from the landfill. The nation mourned. A 20-month-old baby had been thrown away like garbage by his own mother. As the criminal case developed, prosecutors built a devastating timeline of events. Evidence suggested that Leilani Simon had killed her son during the early morning hours of October 5th, possibly by suffocation or another means that left little physical evidence. She then placed his body in a dumpster near the home she shared with her mother and her other children. Security footage showed her making trips to the dumpster during the time frame when Quentin's body would have been disposed of. When she reported him missing later that morning, she was already engaged in a cover-up. Her frantic mother routine was an act designed to deflect suspicion. Why would a mother kill her toddler? The investigation revealed that Leilani Simon was struggling with substance abuse and was overwhelmed by the responsibilities of motherhood. She had been partying and using drugs while her children were in the home. Text messages and social media posts showed that she viewed Quentin as a burden. She had complained about him to friends and family. She had expressed resentment about having to care for him. Witnesses testified that in the days before Quentin's death, Leilani had been particularly volatile and had been using drugs heavily. On the night of October 4th into the early morning of October 5th, she was high, and something happened that led her to kill her son. Whether it was frustration, anger, or a desire to be free from parental responsibilities, Leilani Simon made a choice that night. And that choice cost Quentin his life. Leilani Simon was arrested and charged with malice murder, felony murder, concealing the death of another, and false reporting. She was held without bond at the Chatham County Detention Center. Her trial began in October of 2024, exactly 2 years after Quentin's disappearance. The prosecution presented a compelling case. The timeline of events, physical evidence from the home, surveillance footage, cell phone data, witness testimony about Simon's behavior and statements, and the damning fact that Quentin's body was found exactly where investigators said it would be based on their theory of the case. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that someone else could have killed Quentin, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the investigation had been biased against Simon from the beginning. But the jury saw through these arguments. The evidence was overwhelming. On October 9, 2024, Leilani Simon was convicted on all counts. The sentencing phase was emotionally charged. Quentin's grandmother, Leilani's own mother, gave a victim impact statement condemning her daughter and mourning the grandson who was stolen from her. Other family members spoke of Quentin's bright smile, his developing personality, his love of playing and exploring. They spoke of the hole his death left in their lives and their rage at the person who killed him. On October 21, 2024, Judge Tammy Stokes sentenced Leilani Simon to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the other charges. However, under Georgia law, she must serve a minimum of 40 years before being eligible for parole consideration. Let's do the math. Leilani Simon was 22 years old at the time of sentencing. 40 years from then, she'll be 62 years old, if she's even still alive. And even then, parole is far from guaranteed. Given the heinous nature of her crime, the fact that she killed her own toddler and threw his body in a landfill, it's extremely unlikely that Georgia's parole board will ever grant her release. The board is notoriously strict about violent offenders, especially those who have harmed children. For all practical purposes, Leilani Simon will die in prison. She will never know freedom again. She will never raise another child. She will spend decades behind bars, and that is exactly what justice demands. Leilani Simon is currently incarcerated at Pulaski State Prison in Georgia. She has filed appeals, all of which have been denied. She maintains her innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against her. Meanwhile, Quentin Simon rests in peace, finally home with family who loved him. His grave is visited regularly by relatives who remember the bright, beautiful toddler whose life was cut short by the one person who should have protected him. His death sparked conversations about child welfare, substance abuse, and the systems designed to protect vulnerable children. But no reforms can bring Quentin back or undo the horror of what happened to him. Case 10. Uriah Ridge, the frozen child. Our final case is one of the most recent and perhaps one of the most preventable tragedies on this list. In January of 2024, 3-year-old Alina Pascal froze to death in the woods of North Georgia, while her mother, Uriah Ridge, was high on drugs. The details of this case are heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. On January 12, 2024, authorities in Murray County, Georgia received a report of a missing child. 3-year-old Alina Pascal, also known as Hannah Nicole Ridge, had been left in the woods during sub-freezing temperatures. When deputies arrived, they found a scene that would haunt them forever. Little Alina was discovered in a wooded area near her mother's residence. She was unconscious and suffering from severe hypothermia. Her body temperature had dropped to dangerously low levels. Emergency responders rushed Alina to the hospital, but it was too late. The 3-year-old was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The cause of death, hypothermia. She had frozen to death. As investigators pieced together what happened, a picture emerged of stunning neglect and criminal indifference to a child's life. Uriah Ridge, 33 years old, had been using drugs, specifically cocaine and marijuana, on the night of January 11th into the early morning of January 12th. While high, she took her 3-year-old daughter into the woods near their home. The temperature that night dropped below freezing. It was bitterly cold, dangerous conditions for anyone, but especially for a small child. According to the investigation, Ridge left Alina in the woods and returned to the residence. She did not properly dress the child for the weather. She did not ensure the child had shelter or warmth. She simply abandoned her daughter in sub-freezing temperatures while she was intoxicated. Let that sink in. A mother, high on drugs, took her 3-year-old daughter into freezing woods and left her there to die. By the time Ridge alerted anyone to Alina's location, or someone else discovered the situation, it was too late. The little girl had been exposed to the cold for hours. Her tiny body couldn't regulate its temperature. She froze to death, alone and scared, abandoned by the one person who should have kept her safe. The medical examiner's report detailed the effects of severe hypothermia on a 3-year-old body. Alina would have experienced confusion, drowsiness, and eventually loss of consciousness as her body temperature dropped. It would have been a terrifying, painful death. When police questioned Uriah Ridge, she initially gave conflicting accounts of what happened. Her statements were inconsistent and evasive. But as evidence mounted, the truth became undeniable. Toxicology tests confirmed that Ridge had cocaine and marijuana in her system. Witnesses testified about her drug use. The timeline established that Ridge had been responsible for Alina's care and had made the decision to take her into the woods. Investigators also discovered that this wasn't the first time Child Protective Services had been involved with the family. There had been previous reports of neglect and drug use, but Alina had remained in Ridge's care. The system had failed this 3-year-old girl, and now she was dead. In addition to charges related to Alina's death, Ridge faced drug possession charges for the cocaine and marijuana found in her system and in the residence. These charges painted a picture of a woman whose addiction had completely overtaken her ability to parent safely. Family members and neighbors expressed shock and grief. Some said they had concerns about Ridge's parenting, but never imagined something this horrific could happen. Others said the tragedy was preventable if the system had taken more aggressive action earlier. Uriah Ridge was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, second-degree cruelty to children, reckless conduct, and drug possession. She was held without bond at the Murray County Jail. Her trial took place in late 2024. The prosecution presented medical evidence about the cause of death, timeline evidence placing Ridge and Alina in the woods during the critical hours, toxicology evidence showing Ridge's drug use, and testimony from witnesses and investigators. The defense attempted to argue that Ridge hadn't intended to kill Alina, that the exposure was accidental, that her judgment was impaired by drugs. But the prosecution countered that choosing to use drugs while caring for a 3-year-old, then taking that child into freezing woods, was itself a criminally reckless act that led directly to death. The jury agreed. On November 22, 2024, Uriah Ridge was convicted on all counts. At sentencing, the judge didn't hold back. He stated that Ridge's actions were unconscionable and depraved. He noted that Alina had been completely dependent on her mother for safety and care, and that Ridge had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. Alina's family members gave victim impact statements describing the bright, energetic 3-year-old who loved to play and laugh. They described the horror of knowing she died alone in the cold, abandoned by her own mother. On December 6, 2024, Uriah Ridge was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. However, legal experts note that given the circumstances of the case and Georgia's strict parole board, actual release is extremely unlikely. While Ridge's sentence technically includes the possibility of parole, several factors make actual parole highly improbable. First, this is a recent conviction. The parole board typically requires decades of demonstrated rehabilitation before considering release for violent offenses involving children. Second, the nature of the crime. A mother allowing her young child to freeze to death while high on drugs is exactly the type of case that generates public outrage and opposition to parole. Third, Georgia's parole board is one of the strictest in the nation. The grant rate for violent offenders is extremely low, often in the single digits percentage-wise. Fourth, Alina's family will have the opportunity to attend parole hearings and advocate against release. The impact of their statements cannot be understated. For all practical purposes, Uriah Ridge will spend the rest of her life in prison. Even if she becomes eligible for parole after serving a minimum sentence, the likelihood of the board granting release to someone who killed a 3-year-old through such criminal neglect is vanishingly small. Uriah Ridge is currently incarcerated at Arendelle State Prison in Georgia. She is serving her sentence alongside several of the other women on this list, women who, like her, betrayed the sacred bond of motherhood in the most horrific ways imaginable. Alina Pascal was buried in a ceremony attended by family members and community members who mourned a life cut tragically short. She was only 3 years old, just beginning to develop her personality, to learn about the world, to experience all the joys of childhood. Instead, she died alone in the freezing cold, abandoned by the one person who should have protected her. That is the reality of this case. That is the reality of all 10 cases we've covered today. We've journeyed through 10 of the most disturbing criminal cases in Georgia history. 10 women who were mothers, stepmothers, or mother figures. 10 women who violated the most fundamental bond of human existence, the bond between a parent and child. As we reflect on these cases, certain patterns emerge. Common threads that connect these disparate tragedies. First, isolation. In nearly every case, these women isolated their victims. They withdrew children from school. They cut off contact with extended family. They created environments where no outside eyes could witness what was happening. Emani Moss was pulled from school before Tiffany Moss starved her to death. Mary and Elwyn Crocker Jr. were hidden away while being tortured by Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright. Jennifer Rosenbaum kept Layla Daniels separate from other children in the foster home. Isolation is the weapon of choice for child abusers. It ensures no one can intervene, no one can report, no one can save the victim. Second, systemic failures. Many of these cases involved prior contact with Child Protective Services or other agencies designed to protect children. Reports were made. Concerns were raised. But the children remained in dangerous homes until it was too late. The system isn't perfect. Social workers are overworked and underfunded. They make judgment calls with incomplete information. But when we look at cases like Layla Daniel, Alina Pascal, and Kobe Shaw, children who died after the system had been alerted, we have to acknowledge that reforms are desperately needed. Third, differential treatment. Several of these cases involved mothers who fed and cared for some children while starving or abusing others. Tiffany Moss fed her biological children while starving Emani. Candice Crocker raised her own children normally while torturing her stepchildren. Jennifer Rosenbaum kept other foster children healthy while Layla Daniel wasted away. This differential treatment proves these weren't accidents or mistakes. These women made deliberate choices about who deserved care and who deserved cruelty. They weren't incapable of parenting. They chose to harm specific children. Fourth, substance abuse played a role in several cases. Lamora Williams, Leilani Simon, Uriah Ridge, and Tanya Monroe all had histories of drug or alcohol abuse that contributed to their crimes. This doesn't excuse their actions. Millions of people struggle with addiction without harming children. But it highlights the devastating impact substance abuse can have on vulnerable family members, especially children who depend on addicted parents for care. Finally, and perhaps most disturbingly, all 10 of these women displayed a stunning lack of empathy. They watched children suffer and felt nothing. They inflicted pain and showed no remorse. Even after conviction, most maintained their innocence or showed no genuine understanding of the horror they'd caused. Lynn Turner poisoned 2 men and collected insurance money without batting an eye. Candice Crocker buried children in her backyard and carried on with life as normal. Leilani Simon threw her toddler in a dumpster and then reported him missing with fake tears. These are not normal human responses. These are the actions of people who lack the basic emotional capacity that defines humanity. As we close this documentary, it's crucial that we remember this isn't really a story about 10 evil women. It's a story about their victims. Innocent children whose lives were stolen by the people who should have protected them. 10-year-old Emani Moss, who loved school and should have grown up to chase her dreams. 1-year-old Jacarter Penn and 2-year-old Keont Penn, who should have grown up together as brothers. 4-year-old Anthony Weiss, who was just learning about the world. 2-year-old Layla Daniel, who deserved a safe, loving home. Glenn Turner and Randy Thompson, fathers who should have lived to raise their children. 14-year-old Mary Crocker and 12-year-old Elwyn Crocker Jr., teenagers who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. 7-month-old Kobe Shaw, who barely got to experience life at all. 20-month-old Quentin Simon, whose bright smile is frozen in photographs, never to age another day. 3-year-old Alina Pascal, who froze to death alone in the woods. These are the names we should remember. These are the lives that matter. These are the victims who deserved so much better than what they received. The 10 women we've discussed today are serving sentences that ensure they will never again harm another child. 8 of them will never be eligible for parole. 2 have extremely unlikely chances of ever being released. Some might ask, is this justice? Is life without parole appropriate for these crimes? When we consider what these women did, the prolonged suffering they inflicted, the deliberate choices they made, the innocent lives they destroyed, the answer becomes clear. Tiffany Moss sits on death row, awaiting an execution that may never come due to Georgia's current moratorium on the death penalty. But she'll never leave that prison alive. Lamora Williams will spend every remaining day of her life behind bars, which seems like a small price to pay for burning 2 young boys in an oven. Sophia Williams will never celebrate another Mother's Day as a free woman, which is fitting given how catastrophically she failed at motherhood. Jennifer Rosenbaum will die in prison, just as Layla Daniel died under her supposed care. Lynn Turner already died in prison, her plans for a comfortable life funded by murder insurance money forever thwarted. Candice Crocker and Kimberly Wright will spend their remaining years locked up together in the same prison system, both serving life without parole for the torture murder of 2 children. Tanya Monroe will never hold another grandchild, never enjoy another family gathering, never know freedom again. Leilani Simon will be an old woman, if she lives that long, before she's even eligible for parole, and even then, release is virtually impossible. And Uriah Ridge will face the same reality, decades behind bars with almost no chance of parole for allowing her daughter to freeze to death. This is justice, not perfect justice. Nothing can bring back the children who died, but it's the best justice our system can deliver, ensuring these women never have the opportunity to harm another child. What can we learn from these 10 horrific cases? How can we prevent similar tragedies in the future? First, we must empower and believe children. Many abuse victims try to tell adults what's happening, but they're not believed or their concerns are dismissed. We need to create environments where children feel safe reporting abuse and where adults take those reports seriously. Second, we need to adequately fund and staff child protective services. Social workers are doing critically important work with impossible caseloads. They need more resources, better training, and systemic support to identify and intervene in abuse situations before they become fatal. Third, we must take substance abuse seriously, especially when children are involved. Addiction doesn't excuse abuse, but addressing addiction early can prevent some of these tragedies. We need better access to treatment and more aggressive interventions when addicted parents are caring for children. Fourth, schools and communities must remain vigilant. Teachers, neighbors, extended family members, anyone who interacts with children should be trained to recognize signs of abuse and should feel empowered to report concerns. Isolation is an abuser's best weapon. Community connection is our best defense. Fifth, the justice system must take child abuse seriously at every level. This means prosecutors who prioritize these cases, judges who impose appropriate sentences, and a prison system that ensures these offenders never have the opportunity to harm children again. Since some of these cases, Georgia has implemented reforms. Layla's law increased oversight of foster homes. Emani's case led to changes in how schools report prolonged absences. Each tragedy has sparked conversations about how to do better, but laws and policies are only as good as their implementation. We must remain committed to protecting children, even when it's difficult, even when it requires resources, even when it means making hard decisions about removing children from dangerous homes. It's important to acknowledge that these 10 cases, while horrific, represent a tiny fraction of mothers in Georgia and nationwide. The vast majority of mothers are loving, protective, and would sacrifice anything for their children's well-being. These cases shock us precisely because they're aberrations, violations of the deepest human bonds and instincts. But we must resist the temptation to dismiss these women as simply monsters or evil. While their actions were monstrous and evil, understanding how and why these tragedies occurred is crucial to preventing future cases. Some of these women had histories of abuse themselves. Some struggled with mental illness or addiction. Some lived in poverty and isolation. These factors don't excuse their crimes, but they do provide context for how someone could fail so catastrophically at the most fundamental human duty, protecting children. Preventing future cases like these requires addressing root causes. Better mental health services, especially for new mothers and those at risk of postpartum depression or psychosis. More robust substance abuse treatment programs that prioritize families with children. Economic support for struggling families so that financial stress doesn't contribute to neglect or abuse. Better screening and support for foster and adoptive parents to ensure they're equipped to handle the challenges. And fundamentally, a cultural shift that recognizes child abuse as the serious crime it is and treats it with appropriate urgency at every level. We've covered 10 cases today. 10 women who violated the sacred bond of motherhood. 10 sets of victims who deserved so much better. 10 life sentences that ensure these women will never harm another child. These stories are difficult to hear. They should be difficult to hear. The fact that they disturb us, that they anger us, that they break our hearts, that's appropriate. That's human. As we process these cases, let's channel that emotion into action. Support organizations that protect children. Advocate for better funding for child protective services. Speak up when you suspect abuse. Be the voice for children who can't speak for themselves. And let's honor the memories of those who died by working to ensure no other child suffers the same fate. Emani Moss, Jacarter Penn, Kayant Penn, Anthony Weiss, Layla Daniel, Glenn Turner, Randy Thompson, Mary Crocker, Elwin Crocker Jr., Kobe Shaw, Quentin Simon, Alina Pascal. Say their names. Remember their faces. And never forget that behind every statistic about child abuse is a real child who deserved to live, to thrive, to grow up safe and loved. This has been Unfiltered Cold Cases. Thank you for watching this difficult but important documentary. If you found this content valuable, please hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on these cases. And please, subscribe to Unfiltered Cold Cases and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dive investigations into the darkest corners of true crime. Remember, the more we understand about these cases, the better equipped we are to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never stop fighting for those who can't fight for themselves.